be more efficient. What, in your opinion, would be the role of the Canadian Water Agency in this leadership that several people mentioned, saying that we needed more data, more collaboration in order to work in a more efficient way? And several levels of government and associations. We talked about agricultural producers also who need data in order to be able to manage everything. Mr. DeMarco. So it's a bill, and so I can't talk about it very much, but I have read this bill. It's rather more of a framework for the agency. There's not a lot of detail. There are not many objectives. It's really enabling legislation. So we'll see what the agency will do. But coordination, collaboration, the use of all powers which the federal government has with fisheries, so navigation, their international power, their criminal law powers, as with SEPA, or legal powers. And I would like us to be able to focus on results. That's something that we often don't have with these kind of bill that's just a framework. I would like to see that they have real targets and objectives for freshwater in Canada. As a Canadian, I come from southwestern Ontario. I see that we have a lot of similar problems with Lake Erie that we had in the 70s. So I would be happy if the agency could be focused on results and would use all the powers that the federal government has to improve the situation with the freshwater in Canada. So I don't have a lot of time, but what should the OCDE definition be adopted for the HER and PFAS? So very generally speaking, I often what is drinkable, swimmable, and fishable water. The Great Lakes should all be, and so these are targets that would really improve the state of freshwater. So we're finished now. So briefly, yes or no, should we adopt the OCDE standard?
We're done. I'm sorry. So another witness for the a witness for the second panel. I want to thank all the panelists for being here and offering insight and information for the study report. So thank you very much, and we'll just take a quick break. Thanks. Collègues, on va reprendre.
So, dear colleagues, we'll take our seats again. I'd like to tell you that Ms. Olsgaard has passed her sound test. So we will be starting. Please take your seats again.
OK. Alors, nous avons en ligne.
So online with us, we have Ms. Mandy Olsgaard, Senior Toxicologist and Risk Assessor. She is appearing as an individual today.
Us online. You have 5 minutes for opening an opening statement. Unfortunately, I'll have to, stop you at 5 minutes if you get up to that point. And then there'll be lots of time for questions. I'm sure there'll be many questions directed at you. So we'll start with you, Ms. Olsgaard, for 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. As a professional biologist and toxicologist who has worked for the Alberta Energy Regulator, and as an independent consultant assessing health risks in Alberta for the past 17 years, I have the privilege of working closely with Métis and First Nation communities up and downstream of oil sands mine development. I don't sit in an ivory tower. I sit in planes flying over the oil sands, experiencing the nauseating air emissions firsthand, and on the backs of skidoos and in boats skirting across the Northern Boreal, listening to Indigenous people share their knowledge of the land and water and how it has changed over time. I sit at kitchen tables and listen to their health concerns. Then, reflecting on this knowledge, I conduct community-based monitoring and health risk studies. I will touch on 3 issues I've identified through this research as outlined in my brief. First, I will discuss how provincial and federal surface water quality guidelines do not consider the toxicity of chemical substances to humans. These surface water quality guidelines focus on the protection of aquatic life and were established using data for fish and other aquatic species. Therefore, the use of these guidelines to assess surface water quality and risks does not consider human health endpoints or the potential for chemicals to cause cancer. In development of Indigenous criteria, we compared published surface and drinking water quality guidelines for each chemical monitored in surface water programs across the Lower Athabasca region and found that 50% of all chemical substances monitored for in these waters are more toxic to humans than to aquatic receptors. I note this as statements by representatives of Imperial and the AER asserted there were no risks to human health from the Curl releases. However, the information available on their respective websites indicates surface water quality guidelines were relied on to assess data at impacted wetlands and surface water bodies, and as such would not have considered human health. Second, my review of reports submitted by oil sands operators to the AER identified a source of contamination that is not well documented. Over 40 approved releases of industrial wastewater from oil sands mines, even though federal effluent regulations for oil sands mines are not yet available under the Fisheries Act. Industrial wastewater is not tailings pond water. It is effluent from non-contact sources such as cooling towers and surface runoff, an important distinction, and these releases are not the focus of ongoing tailings water treatment and release discussions. Year over year, operators report to the AER that the quality of these releases to local rivers and tributaries are exceeding surface water quality guidelines for salts, metals, nutrients, and is at times chronically toxic. The most recent surface water monitoring report by the government of Alberta, the backstop for assessing change in this region, reported that concentrations of lithium, uranium, and sulfate, which were significantly different than historical conditions and exceeding compliance triggers. Based on this information, the AER is aware that wastewater released from oil sands mines is exceeding provincial and federal surface water quality guidelines, and that the provincial government has identified changing conditions in the Lower Athabasca River downstream of oil sands development. Yet there is no evidence that the AER has identified regulatory actions for oil sands operators. It is unclear whether these releases are in contravention of the Federal Fisheries Act through deposition of deleterious substances to surface waters in the Lower Athabasca region. Third, I would like to talk about the current and future risks to human and environmental health from tailings ponds. Understanding the extent of potential health risk is limited as oil sands operators control access to all information related to tailings. I was able to access reports submitted to the AER by request and payment of a fee. From a review of these, I've identified several issues, but due to time constraints, will emphasize 2 points. First, my review of the Imperial Curl groundwater monitoring data led me to conclude in November 2022 what we all learned in February 2023, that tailings contaminated groundwater from the Curl mine was seeping off lease. It was also evident that at least 3 years prior to the issuance of the EPO, Imperial was reporting groundwater contamination and seepage to the AER, but delayed in turning the seepage interception system on. However, the Imperial Curl release is a symptom of a larger regulatory oversight problem. Industry designs unlined ponds and then requests, and the AER approves seepage from these tailings ponds to groundwater. The contamination of groundwater in proximity to tailings ponds is occurring at each oil sands mine. The extent and offsite impacts can be verified by review of annual groundwater monitoring submissions.
Thank you. Unfortunately, I have to stop you there for now. Professor Rona. Professor Rona, nice to see you. Professor is the Svare, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, Research Chair, Integrated Watershed Processes at the University of Calgary, I believe. Is that correct? Yeah. Go ahead, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Today gives me, and committee, thank you very much. It gives me a great pleasure to provide you a brief on monitoring, evaluation, and reporting challenges for freshwater systems in Canada. In Canada and globally, surface and groundwater resources are under increasing environmental threats associated with anthropogenic environmental stressors. Quantifying, understanding, predicting the changes in water quantity, quality, and aquatic biota in response to these multiple stressors requires a coordinated, integrated, credible monitoring, evaluation, reporting system, and I refer to this as an MER system, to inform what actions are necessary to ensure the conservation, protection, security, and sustainability of our water resources. Effective design and implementation of an integrated system requires the acquisition and timely reporting of relevant environmental information. Moreover, integrated watershed management requires the ability to define appropriate baseline conditions against which to assess change, as well as identify and track any environmental impacts and the capacity to assess and predict cumulative effects. In addition, a critical and ongoing gap has been associated with the recognition and the need to use multiple knowledge systems and ways of knowing in monitoring, evaluation, reporting, design, and integrating Indigenous knowledge holders in the co-design and implementation of such programs. So using the Athabasca River Basin as a case example, I would like to highlight some of the challenges and possible solutions associated with implementing an integrated and effective monitoring program. The Athabasca River Basin and associated larger Mackenzie River Basin have become one of the most monitored and studied freshwater systems in Canada. However, substantial knowledge gaps and uncertainties in how the basin and downstream ecosystems are changing in relation to increasing environmental stressors associated with regional development and population growth. Coupled with economic growth are increasing Indigenous community concerns living in and downstream of these developments. The committee has already had other presentations from Indigenous community leaders and other representatives identifying growing concerns regarding whether the current environmental regulatory frameworks are adequate in protecting the environment upon which their way of life depends. So where are we now? Previous government-led and independent expert reviews of regional oil sands monitoring in the Athabasca Basin found despite long-term and long-standing commitments to implement integrated monitoring and related cumulative effects assessment, there was little tangible progress in advancing the assessment and related regulatory policies. After decades and hundreds of millions of dollars spent on environmental monitoring and research in the Athabasca Basin, significant challenges remain in providing open, transparent, accessible data, which are only used to a fraction of their potential to inform state and condition of environment reporting and relevant environmental management decision-making and actions. There are currently at least 10 different types of monitoring programs conducted in the basin. Open access to the data collected under many of these programs remains difficult, if not impossible, to obtain. Moreover, these data have differing quality assurance, quality control practices, including analytical standards and inconsistent forms of public reporting. We simply don't need another website collating fragmented data. We need systematic change in how we design and implement an effective monitoring, evaluation, reporting system. Finally, for many monitoring programs, there are no clearly defined decision criteria and no on or off switch for ratcheting up or down or increasing the intensity of and frequency of monitoring, which is a core principle of adaptive monitoring. So in closing, with the right commitment and expertise, it is possible to develop an adaptive framework with defined criteria for changing monitoring intensity and related reporting, thereby ensuring the best cost-effective use of scientific and technical resources. A previous presentation made to this committee by Drs. Pietranero and Clark from the University of Calgary provided the rationale and recommendations on the need for a new unified national environmental prediction system for Canada, built on an interoperable computational framework and related data management system. Correspondingly, properly designed monitoring, evaluation, reporting systems would provide the data necessary to support such a prediction system for fresh waters. Defragmentation of current approaches and enhancing the application of new automated monitoring and reporting technologies could provide more standardized, cost-effective, and timely information to focus future efforts on areas of priority. It is crucial to forge new partnerships to develop the next generation of monitoring and evaluation systems. Linkages with programs like the new United Nations Transdisciplinary Water Hub at the University of Calgary and other university-based programs can serve as incubators and accelerators to forge a national and international collaborative pathway to connect research advances to management and policy actions to environmental monitoring prediction initiatives.
Sorry, Professor, I'm going to have to stop you there. It was fascinating. We went over a little bit of time because I was so riveted on what you were saying, but we'll come back to you with questions. We'll go now to Ryan Bierbach, is it? Am I pronouncing that properly? Of the chair of the Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Beef.
You let Dwayne start, if that's
as you wish, but 5 minutes total, sure. Go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and committee members. Good afternoon. My name is Dwayne Thompson, and I'm a rancher from Saskatchewan. I have the pleasure of chairing the Canadian Cattle Association Environment Committee. Joining me today is fellow rancher and chair of the Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, Ryan Paperback. We're pleased to participate in your committee's freshwater study. CCA represents 60,000 beef producers across Canada, and we are world leaders in sustainable production for high-quality beef, one of the lowest greenhouse gas footprints per unit of production in the world, roughly half the global average. While contributing significantly to the Canadian economy and environment, the beef industry accounts for only 2.45% of the country's total greenhouse gas footprint. Beef producers steward over 44 million acres of grasslands, which store at least 1.5 billion tons of carbon and contribute to the largest portion of wildlife habitat and biodiversity, comprising of 68% of wildlife habitat on just 33% of total agricultural land in Canada. As the committee has heard from us before, we take our commitments to environmental stewardship seriously. Water management is a key part of the stewardship, and we have made strong progress, but we're not about to rest on our laurels. The Canadian beef industry has created ambitious goals towards 2030 that look at the whole picture of an environment, from emissions intensity reduction to conservation of grasslands and other considerations, including fresh water. Water and water security is critical to continued agriculture production, but also to ensuring animal health, soil health, and infrastructure both on farms and surrounding habitats. Our commitment focuses on how beef producers rely on fresh water, the infrastructure that surrounds fresh water, and how that impacts food production and our environmental goals regarding fresh water. With the new Canadian Water Agency in development and further attention being placed on fresh water, we need to ensure that farmers and ranchers are a key part of the conversation. We take into account the landscapes, how fresh water interacts with agriculture production, and where key infrastructure support is needed. Beef farms and ranches operate across immense open forested landscapes. Much of our lands, such as pastures, riparian areas, and forest range, are natural water storage and filtration systems. Because of the need for water, our beef farms and ranches are established, for a large part, in close proximity to water sources. Water needs to be accessed in many cases, moved or directed for drainage, crop irrigation, and livestock watering to manage ranch operations. While irrigation is mostly a provincial jurisdiction, the access to irrigation for cattle producers is important to note for your study's consideration. Given the role that farmers and ranchers play in the food production, while conserving the ecosystems on the surrounding beef operations, we need to ensure agriculture-related activities are taken into account when making policies and regulations. We pay particular attention to how the federal government's policies on water can unintentionally impact agriculture practices and infrastructure and food production. On this point, I'd like to mention minor works and minor freshwater policy regulations. While these policies are not a focal point of the freshwater study, we have general concerns about routine activities and small projects on beef operations in relation to fresh water. We ask that members of Parliament consider the potential impacts of future and existing legislation and regulation on agriculture operations. Exemptions for agriculturally related routine activities should always be a consideration so as not to negatively impact fresh water and food production. Further, beef producers have concerns about private bodies of fresh water on their land and how government policy may impact the agriculture production. For example, where a normally self-contained lake or farm on a farm or ranch experiences runoff or a flood in the event of substantial overflow, the overflow runs downslope and exists on private property of ranch into public areas. There is considerable concern that during such a situation that the public could claim navigable access rights to the albeit temporary flowing and possibly now navigable waters. We need to remove the ambiguity around the intent to prevent the misuse of these waters by the general public.
Thank you.
We feel policymakers should consider these sorts of scenarios and their potential impacts on agriculture operations.
Thank you. Thank you. That's good. Yeah, thank you. You hit a number of points there that I think are quite interesting. So we'll go now to Chief Lance Haymond of the, I hope I pronounced this properly, Paperback First Nation. Is that? Oh, good. Okay, go ahead. You have 5 minutes, please.
So good afternoon, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. My name is Lance Haymond, and I represent the Algonquin community of Paperback. I'd like to talk to you today about the nuclear waste poisoning the Ottawa River as a result of a project of the near-surface disposal facility project that will be built at the Canadian Nuclear Laboratories at Chalk River, Ontario. The Kitchissippi, as we call it, or the Ottawa River, has been our home and highway since time immemorial. For thousands of years, the Algonquin Nation respected this waterway. Today, the Kitchissippi is a water source that provides drinking water for over 10 million people. For this reason, I will outline our concerns about the short and long-lived radionuclides proposed for the Chalk River above-ground nuclear disposal mound and the potential for radioactive leakage and nuclear waste poisoning of the Ottawa River. Chalk River continues to play an important role in the international nuclear development. In 1944, it was part of the Manhattan Project to actually produce the world's first heavy water reactors to produce plutonium for bombs. 250 kilograms of plutonium was sold to the American military for use in nuclear weapons. Chalk River began as a very secretive establishment in 1944. Algonquin communities were never consulted. You have to understand that in 1944, my ancestors were struggling to survive because of the onslaught of colonization and the pushing them further north along on the Ottawa River. The result is that the Chalk River site is very heavily contaminated with lots of radioactive waste materials, 21 tanks of liquid waste, 5 or 6 different waste areas containing intermediate to high-level waste. There is also waste of two reactor accidents that took place in 1952 and 58. The world's first nuclear meltdown took place at Chalk River. in 1952. In 2006, the government in Canada initiated a program called the Nuclear Waste Legacies Liabilities Program to clean up the waste. In 2015, they hired a consortium of multinational corporations to carry out this work. The consortium conveniently decided to build a waste dump 7 stories high, 1 kilometer from the Ottawa River, which feeds down into the St. Lawrence. 140 municipalities along the watershed have expressed opposition to the permanent disposal site. Over 3,000 people recently signed a House of Commons petition requesting the Government of Canada to stop the project. The Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission approved the project construction in January 2024, despite 10 of the 11 Algonquin communities expressing strong opposition. The project is at a height of land that drains into the wetlands that drain into the Ottawa River. The waste is going to leak into the Ottawa River, and that is basically our complaint. Why was this site selected? We believe it's just simply a matter of convenience. In this view, it's easiest to push the waste of the perimeter to the property. In our view, it has the potential to poison our water supply and immediately destroy an old-growth forest with active bear dens and other species at risk. In our view, the project is the wrong technology in the wrong location. There are not temporary projects. This dump would be a permanent facility. 19 of the 29 radionuclides listed in the disposal inventory have half-lives of more than 1,000 years. This is a long-lived radioactivity on-site. Water treatment is only planned to be continued for 30 years. And after this, it's just up to whatever the synthetic liner is to hold the wastewater material in place. Paperback has been very clear to Canada should not dump garbage where you draw your water. Canada should not have approved a permanent nuclear waste dump on Algonquin sacred territory. According to Article 29 of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, there should be not any kind of storage or disposal of toxic materials on Indigenous lands without the free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous people. You know, this government takes pride in its adoption of UNDRIP. The problem is that their actions don't necessarily correlate with their words. The Kitsisibi is the bloodline for the Algonquin people. It feeds all living things, and if you poison the lifeblood, then you poison everything. And so we are faced today with an intergenerational challenge at Chalk River, and we have to think of it in those terms and consider whether the NSDF project is the best solution to keep nuclear waste out of our food chain and drinking water. Paperback has been clear that the NSDF is not the best solution. And Dr. Gordon Edwards of the Canadian Coalition for Nuclear Responsibility notes, a solution would mean that we know how to neutralize it or render it harmless. Canadian Nuclear Laboratories and a consortium do not know how to do that. That is why Paperback and others are seeking and filed a judicial review with the federal court to annul the licensing decision.
Thank you, Chief. I want to leave time for questions because I think you'll get many questions. Okay, we'll start the 6-minute round with Mr. Cramp.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to all the witnesses for being here today. I'd like to start with the witnesses from the Canadian Cattle Association. Mr. Thompson, in your opening statement, I believe you said that Canadian cattle producers have a carbon footprint about 1/2 the global average. Could you explain to the committee how Canadian cattle producers are able to do that and how they have such a low carbon footprint?
Thank you for the question. The Canadian cattle industry has long taken a serious effort at quantifying and doing the research necessary to find out just what our footprint is. And through that research, Ryan's on the Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Beef. A lot of that research has happened through that. And what they've come up with is that our system, with the efficiencies that we've managed to put in place over probably the last 50 years, has made it that we're one of the most efficient producers of high-quality protein.
Yeah, I can add a little bit to that. So when you look at a lot of other parts of the world, it's the resources are maybe cheap, so they're not as concerned about wasting them. Where in Canada, our resources are relatively expensive. So when we look at making it economically viable for production, we have to do a really good job here. And we put a lot of money into research that helps improve our efficiencies. And when you can produce more pounds of beef with the same amount of resources, that's where we really see that carbon footprint shrink. We did our National Beef Sustainability Assessment 7 years ago, and then just finished our second one, and we saw that our footprint went down 15%. And when we look at what drove that, it was things like growing cattle faster with the same amount of feed. Just in a lot of cases it was genetics, and it was the feed that we feed the cattle and balancing the rations and just making sure that we really take care of the resources we have. And that's what has really helped us reduce our footprint. And, in North America, we do a way better job than a lot of parts of the world. And then in Canada, we devote a lot of money and resources from the cattle industry to make sure that we can keep improving.
Has anyone from the federal government ever approached your organization about sharing these best practices with other countries and counting those activities towards Canada's emissions reductions targets?
Not really from the federal government. I sit on the Global Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, so we share our production practices with other parts of the world so that we can help bring the entire beef industry up. We do a really good job of measuring emissions, but we don't measure the carbon sequestration that we do. So we're only really getting half of the equation when we look at the carbon footprint on the beef side. We've done a lot of research in Canada to quantify what we put into the soil, because if you manage properly, that carbon comes out of the air and is stored in the soil, and we see organic matter come up. So it also helps with fertility, helps with biodiversity. So it's a benefit to ranchers. But until we can get that research recognized internationally, we don't get credit for the carbon that we store. And if we don't get it internationally, then Canada won't recognize it. So that's been really a focus for our industry, is to get that accounted for and quantified so that we have the full picture when we are looking at the carbon footprint. That way we can make sure we're doing the best job we can at sequestering and reducing it, on the emission side, but also sequestering as much as we can.
Can you elaborate a bit on the benefits of irrigation and irrigation projects and how that can lead to more carbon sequestration in the soil?
Irrigation has long been a very good insurance, to insure your water source for in southern Alberta, and they've, they are not it's drought mitigation, and if you need it, it's there to use. The current plans to develop it more in Saskatchewan, we're looking forward to that, because you're always at the mercy of the weatherman otherwise, and so to have the irrigation opportunity is a really good thing for the cattle industry to mitigate the, make sure, because in Canada it's a given that a good percentage of the time you're going to have to feed your animals. So to be able to grow feed with and minimize the risk, it's pretty important.
If on the other side of that coin, if a lack of irrigation makes ranchers more susceptible to drought, can you give the committee an idea of what types of federal government programs are available to ranchers who find themselves in that situation?
We do have, in a lot of cases, the federal government will implement a tax deferral, because if you want to take good care of your ranch, in a lot of cases you have to destock when it gets dry so that you take care of your pasture. We see tax deferrals so that we can rebuild without having to pay tax on the money that we got from selling the animals. But in a lot of cases it's almost too late by the time we know about the ability to do a tax deferral, or if you're on the edge of what is classified as a tax deferral zone, you don't qualify, and droughts don't end at a RM line. So it really, we have to change it so it's kind of all-encompassing, where the producer can decide.
Ali, for 6 minutes. Oh, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses. I'd like to start with Dr. Rona. Really interested in your presentation and the monitoring discussion that you were giving us. I'm wondering around, I spoke this morning with the water movement, with the Indigenous water operators that were in Ottawa, and we talked about getting the right information to the operator level so the operators knew when they had to make changes to the system. You talked about open data and the availability of data to get that data to the right place at the right time. I'm wondering about things like naphthenic acid or PFAS, things that could be in the data. Would that be something that would be picked up in monitoring and included in the open data that you were talking about?
And thank you for the question. It depends on the basin and the system. And this is what I was referring to about trying to at least have standardization across watersheds and basins of what core water quality information should be reported and at what time. Surely in the oil sands area, naphthenic acids and those types of contaminants are very critical. And they have monitoring programs in place to actually measure those types of chemicals. That is not ubiquitous in other parts of the country. The same thing is true with respect to municipal wastewater effluent and the complex mixtures there. We don't have necessarily a consistency. We have some core parameters, biological oxygen demand, E. coli, a few things that are measured in nitrogen phosphorus as an example. But there are many other compounds, as been mentioned by many others, that are not necessarily ubiquitously monitored. So I think what the compelling argument would be is that this is where we, unlike other frameworks in Europe and other areas, we should be developing, I think, from a basin management perspective, some standardization in terms of what we expect, in terms of what we monitor and how we report on it.
To what I was thinking of governance around this and who makes those decisions. So a lot of water is, the Alberta Energy Regulator will be on one panel maybe, and Ontario might be on another panel because water is provincial in a lot of cases. How would we recommend through our report to have a governance structure where those decisions could be made after discussions and public consultation? Is that the Canada Water Agency, or what are you thinking there?
Well, what's interesting is one of the recommendations that we placed in our brief is that an organization like the Canada Water Agency could perhaps facilitate the development of a national guidance framework that would provide a more standardized, cohesive, and cost-effective approach to best practices, and also designing what we would consider an adaptive monitoring, evaluation, reporting system. Now, clearly, because it's a federal government agency, maybe the start would be transboundary waters, where there's federal jurisdiction in other areas. But there's lessons learned that could be done in those systems that could then be applied to provincially run watersheds or other areas. But it would be a start.
I'm going to run out of time if I keep going too far into this, but the University of Guelph is looking at habitat loss and around biodiversity and using water sampling as a way of tracking DNA to look at disappearing species. Is technology in the right place where we could go ahead with some of this if it was available through the regulators?
It's advancing. Programs, national programs that were supported by and through Genome Canada, and there's other genomics initiatives that are occurring. I sit on the board for Genome Alberta and other areas. The technologies are developing, and this comes back to the point that I was making, is that we should be, as Canada, we should be looking at our new technologies and approaches and applying them. COVID monitoring is an excellent example where we were a global leader in terms of early detection in our systems. So I think absolutely.
The University of Guelph for being involved with that part. And Dr. Hebert was showing us that it's pennies per sample now when we're doing DNA sampling versus dollars and dollars per sample. So thank you for that. If I can shift over to Mandy Alsgaard, and thank you for your presentation. Looking at the seepage interception system that wasn't turned on at Curl, thinking of, we asked for data as part of our committee and got piles and piles and piles of numbers versus data that we could interpret. is there a summary report you have that you could provide us? Because that's something we were looking for.
Yeah, I haven't published any of this yet, but I have provided, or I will provide a brief to the committee where I'll direct to these reports, and I've given several presentations on it, but no, there's not a good report that summarizes what independent researchers like I have said, or what Imperial and the AAR have done. It sits in random PDFs and websites, as you've noted, so it's really difficult to piece this together. And 5 minutes, I struggled.
That's a role, I think, for our researchers. I also chair the Science and Research Committee, and we look at our universities as trusted sources for information. And maybe there's an opportunity where the government or NSERC could support that activity.
Thank you.
It's a great idea.
Okay, thanks very much. We'll go down to Madame Posey.
Oui, alors merci beaucoup à tous nos témoins.
Yes, so thank you very much to all our witnesses for being there. Thank you, Chief Amon, for having come here to sit at the table with us. It's our 14th meeting, if I'm not mistaken, on freshwater. And there is this nuclear dump project in Chalk River, which threatens the drinking water of millions of citizens. I think there are people here around the table who have doubts about the mobilization that happened against this project. 140 municipalities and 11 Indigenous nations. So do you feel respected? Do you feel you were respected in the consultations and in terms of reconciliation with First Nations?
Jim, what we've learned through this process is that there are, in fact, 140 municipalities and towns and cities up and down the Ottawa River from Ottawa to the St. Lawrence who are opposed and are standing in solidarity with the position taken by Quebec in regards that, again, the NSDF project is not the solution to deal with the nuclear waste at Chalk River. And part of our judicial review, in fact, the largest part of the argument, really relates to the fact that we were not engaged at the outset of this process. In fact, it started in 2013, 14, and we, in spite of our best efforts to identify ourselves that we wanted to be consulted, we were continually scoped out of the process. So in June of 2022, we went before the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission and were able to present evidence and present an argument that, in fact, we had not been properly consulted. They recognized that, made a procedural decision, and gave us, approximately 9 months, to provide input into the process. But most decisions had already been taken, so absolutely there was a problem in terms of consultation. Definitely a lack of respect. And again, I'll come back to the whole issue around United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. Deep consultation is required when Indigenous rights are going to be impacted directly. And when we're talking about a nuclear waste dump, we're talking about the rights of the entire Algonquin Nation and any other nation who's along the Ottawa River watershed will most certainly see their rights impacted. But absolutely not. There's been no respect for including us appropriately in the process. So that's how we ended up in a situation where there was only one solution and only one location. Because, again, had we been involved at the earlier stages when the initial project environmental assessment process was being developed, we most certainly would have requested that additional site selections be looked at and that one site a kilometer from the Ottawa River not be chosen to hold 1 million tons of nuclear waste that is going to leach after the barriers and the synthetic liners break down after 550 years.
Et l'Assemblée, l'association...
And the Assembly of First Nations of Quebec and Labrador, with Chief Ghislain Picard, recognizes your leadership, acknowledges your leadership in this file, Chief Eamon, and reminds us the protection of your ancestral lands is one of your major responsibilities. And so Indigenous peoples expect the government to recognize that reality, as well as the stewardship exercised by Indigenous peoples to preserve their fresh water. And I think you also want the government to acknowledge the weakness of the consultations with the Nuclear Safety Commission. You just explained that the process was quite defective. What does it mean for you to have these allies, for you telling you that there's a solidarity with the Assembly of Indigenous people in Quebec and Labrador?
That we're able to demonstrate that, this is an issue of utmost importance to Indigenous people. Support from the Assembly of First Nations and the Assembly of First Nations of Quebec and Labrador is just some of that support. I think I would also want to highlight the fact that we have support, from groups of non-Indigenous Canadians. As I mentioned previously, 140 municipalities, support and are concerned about this project. So we've done a lot of work and to raise awareness and raise the profile of this issue. And so the support is not only coming from Indigenous organizations, it's coming from non-Indigenous environmental groups, municipalities, and more importantly, I think, recently with our efforts, we've raised the profile of this issue with the Quebec government. And a letter from Minister Lafrenière and Minister Charette was sent to Minister Guilbeault, reminding Quebec that they had a responsibility, reminding Canada that they had a responsibility to protect the environment and to ensure that First Nations like mine were given a fair process. And also in that letter, it indicated that they wanted Canada, to take a closer look and really take into consideration the merits of what we've asked, that this process and the licensing of the NSDF be stopped so that we could take a step back, really look at the issue in its entirety and go back and make sure that
Thank you.
In deliberations and in choosing a technology and a way to deal with nuclear waste, that it would be done
Thank you.
Respectfully.
Thank you. Okay, Mr. Bachrach, nice to have you back with us.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's good to be back. I enjoyed my time at this committee when I was sitting in for my colleague, Ms. Collins, and I know this study is very close to your heart, Mr. Chair, and it's good to see it continuing. I was with the committee for some of the testimony around the Kearl oil sands project and the spills and seepage into the environment from that project. Extremely troubling testimony. Hearing from the Athabascan Chippewa and First Nation about the devastating health impacts that they've suffered downstream, and getting a sense that really the regulators that are responsible for overseeing and protecting the environment seem to be pretty wholly captured by the industry. And I know Ms. Olsgaard has been before the committee before talking about the seepage from the tailings ponds, and today, Ms. Olsgaard, you've brought in a new aspect of concern, which has to do with the release of wastewater effluent from these projects. And listening to your testimony, it made me think about my home community of Smithers. It's a small municipality of about 5,000 people on the bank of the Bulkley River. And, they have an old municipal wastewater treatment plant, and for a number of years have been struggling with compliance with federal regulations around wastewater discharge. And they've been getting repeated letters from the federal government warning them that they're out of compliance and threatening consequences if they don't build better infrastructure and treat their effluent better. And they're still waiting on a grant from the same government that's sending the letters, but that's a separate issue. It seems like the federal regulator in this case is being very proactive with very small communities that have limited financial resources. Are we seeing the same kind of proactive regulation when it comes to these huge oil sands companies that are releasing all of this wastewater effluent into the rivers of the oil sands region?
So in my discussion with, representatives of Environment Canada, no one was aware that these releases existed until I did the review of the industrial wastewater reports. So the regulator had approved them through a provincial process and was regulating them through provincial mechanisms. And I can't find any evidence that, Environment Canada actually knew that there was these over 40 approved discharges of non-tailings water. So I can't say that letters have been issued. Maybe Fisheries or Environment Canada was issuing them directly to the operators, Suncor, Syncrude, Imperial, but I don't have access to that.
At this point, you have no knowledge of any correspondence between the federal government, the provincial government, and the oil sands operators regarding compliance with, I believe you said it was surface water guidelines that are being exceeded?
Yeah, so even the provincial government, so the Alberta Energy Regulator receives these industrial wastewater reports weekly, monthly, and annually, and they're independently managing the exceedances that are being reported. And something that's important here is that through that provincial approval process, the AER actually allows for areas to be impacted. They call them acute and chronic mixing zones, and they allow for exceedances of guidelines in these zones. This is not something, in my understanding, that's allowed under the Fisheries Act. So I think there's a real disconnect here between what's occurring under approval by the Alberta Energy Regulator and what's allowed under the Fisheries Act. And we've seen a couple of